Welcome to the Sanskaari Girls Podcast. I'm Vandita Morarka, and today we're unpacking a question that's been relevant since the 1700s. How do essays function as a feminist form? And our guest today is Rega Jha, a writer who has truly mastered the art of the essay. Based in Chennai, she's the former editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed India and currently writes the weekly newsletter Here Now Studies. Over her decade-long media career, she's produced thousands of pieces of writing, but as she says herself, most prominently, many, many essays. And what makes Rega's work just so compelling is how she's able to use the essay in its form to tackle everything from beauty standards and urban life to feminism and social commentary. And her essays have, of course, appeared across multiple platforms, reaching a massive audience and sparking many important conversations about women's lives in contemporary India. Rega, welcome to the podcast. We're so happy to have you with us.
Vandita, thank you so much. That was so generous and hospitable, and I really appreciate it. I am a nervous podcast guest, so I really thank you.
It's not coming across, but we're so grateful to have you. I'm going to jump right in. Maybe with the first question being, I read somewhere that, you describe yourself as someone who, despite occasional half-hearted attempts to escape this fate, is a writer. And I really love that phrase and I love the feeling behind that. So I'd love to understand from you, what is it about writing and specifically about essays that keeps pulling you back?
That is a very good question. When I'm talking about my attempts to escape writing, I think there's occasionally been a sense that it's a frivolous pursuit of some sort, that the world needs us to do more practical sort of work. Contributing to like the arc towards justice. So there have been phases where I have gone and got myself an NGO job or some sort of, development sector consulting gig to feel like I'm doing something realer. But the pull of writing, I think famously many writers describe it as a mysterious sort of pull. It is the essay specifically, I think, for me is a compelling medium and a sort of addiction to self-interrogation, I think. I think it's such an exciting form in that it is like thinking. And something I recently acknowledged about myself is that thinking has really been a long-term hobby. Like I very vividly remember as like a 8 or 9 year old being really excited when I come up with a question. And I remember sort of asking my parents, did God come first or did humans come first? And feeling really chuffed all day that I came up with an inquiry that was exciting. And I've sort of maybe turned that childhood hobby of curiosity and scribbling curiosity into notebooks and notebooks and notebooks into a career, for which I'm, very lucky and very grateful that, I've been able to do that.
I think something that you shared that's really stayed with me is, you mentioned you tried those development sector gigs, those other things to feel like you're contributing. And it's something that I have come to learn over time that essays and writing, what they did for me is they inspired me to do something that I would have not done. And I think it's so valuable when people don't necessarily leave their jobs and, join the nonprofit space, but are really able to build change from where they are. And something that I know about your writing, for example, I have friends not from the development sector, friends not thinking about feminism or gender, who still read your work and who still engage with it. And I think that's also true for the Sanskaari Girls Book Club, right? It's very different from the other work I do in terms of inspiring or just pushing us towards political education, but it makes real life a political lesson. And I think that's so powerful about your essays and even about essays as a form in themselves. And yeah, so I just wanted to say that I'm really grateful you're not in the development sector because your writing is useful to nudge others into thinking about change where they're at. And that's a really powerful medium as well.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And that's a really good articulation, I think, of my own relationship with the essay as a form, as a reader rather than as a writer is, these, movements, whether it's feminism, whether it's the anti-caste movement, the anti-capitalist movement, these movements are about shifting structures and policies that are beyond the individual. And they are equally about, like you said, a billion individuals rethinking our own actions in the world. And for myself, you're absolutely, that resonated so strongly with me because so much of my own change has emanated from reading something radical and letting that sort of seep into the cracks in my being and do its work from the inside out. So yeah, it's really an honor to be able to do that work in the world. Ultimately, the few voices that were in my mind, which might be in many other writers' minds about whether this is real work, I think it's important to keep having reminders like the one you just said that this is in fact real work when done rigorously and thoughtfully.
Oh, 100%. I think it's easy to pass it off as frivolous. But I know in the immense number of young people we work with, how this one line, one sentence, one piece of writing has transformed how they see themselves and how they see the world. And that's really powerful. And that also takes me to one question. Because we're talking about reading and because we're such an online generation, at BuzzFeed India, you were working in the digital media landscape. And over time, we've just seen attention spans dwindling. A big part of the readers joining the book club is them saying, I want to commit to being able to read. I want to commit to getting attention span back. And content has started moving really fast, right? So in all of this happening around the world, how does the essay fit in? How does it remain effective as a medium for digital offline audiences? What is it about the essay that still keeps people engaged?
Yeah, that's something I think about a lot. Obviously, as someone writing essays and writing them on the internet, there are two things I want to sort of think out loud about here with you. One is that it often strikes me that the essay, in a sense, if you think of the form in the most expansive sense possible, which is it is first person true writing, then it is the lingua franca of the internet. Like most of the social web is first person true confessional writing. It is a processing of personal experience, or at least most of the mainstream social web as we know it. And in that sense, the internet is a gift to the form in that it has allowed, I think, an unprecedented expansion of the ability to publish one's own subjective experience. Obviously, it's not a universal expansion. We know that there are gaps in digital access that very much fall along the classic lines of privilege and marginalization. Like there is a gender access gap, there is a rural urban access gap, there is a class access gap. But even accounting for all that, this is an unprecedented sort of burgeoning of the ability to say, XYZ happened to me, and here's how I felt about it, and here are the citations that I used to think about it, which is an essay in a sense. We can get a bit wild with how expansive we want to be. Like, I have allowed myself to wonder at some point, is the get ready with me video an essay? Does it count or does it not count? Because there is the video essay. We know that there is such a thing as a video essay. A person thinking through the question of which shoes to wear and why, does it count? And I've just allowed myself to ask the question, and I've also allowed myself to say no, it does not count. But my point being, the internet is an explosion of subjective expression. And there has also been this point in the mid 2010s when I was at BuzzFeed, when there was also an explosion of content companies monetizing the form of the personal essay. And there's a great piece called The First Person Industrial Complex that was published in Slate in, I think, the mid 2010s by a writer called Laura Bennett. And this piece examined the first person essay as a sort of object, a monetized object that had sort of been co-opted into a consumerist economy. So that is something that's happened. And jury's out on what the effects of that. There are some very obviously positive effects of it. For instance, I think a culture of confessional expression has enabled something like the Me Too movement. And so, we know that having more voices that are able to just say, this is what happened to me, is a good thing in some senses. So that's one half of the picture of the essay and the internet. And the other half of the picture, I think, is what the sort of contentification of the essay does to the essayist is something I really think about and I worry about, in the sense of, will you allow me a tangent?
Always. Please go ahead.
Okay. So I know there's a lot of hand wringing about what is the distinction between art and content, or what is the distinction between literature and content. And the understanding of it that feels most clarifying to me, that I keep coming back to, is that content is created in order to fit into a sort of predetermined grid of factors. You know what the word length has to be, what kinds of themes are going to be interesting to engage an audience. That kind of language is what sort of um, goes with the production of content, whereas the production of literature or art, I think, is a sort of um, solitary contract between a soul and a piece of paper. There isn't sort of preempted decision making already in place about what medium it's going to be on, what platform, who the intended audience is. All of that is sort of secondary to a urgent need to express something in a certain way. And then later you might get to thinking about, well, where do I put this, and who will pay me for this, and who would be interested in this? But the first impulse is not uh, an impulse that has to do with a platform or a medium. So I worry about the writer whose work primarily exists for platforms that have already set a lot of factors in place. Because I know for myself, for the most part, and I'm very lucky uh, in terms of this fact, for the most part, I have not written for social media directly. I have written for a magazine or a newspaper or my newsletter, where I have utmost freedom. And then I have adapted some pieces for social media. And just that adaptation process has been so illuminating, in that I have noticed, for instance, if I have a 2,000-word essay that I've put on my newsletter, when I'm putting it on Instagram and I'm trying to make it like sort of, a engaging carousel post, I am shortening the sentences. I am putting more line breaks in there so it's sort of more digestible on a phone screen in a square image. Um, I am rethinking my vocabulary, because we know that algorithms are going to flag is like from the river to the sea, or words for sexual violence. Um, and I'm also rethinking, sort of most sort of significantly, what I'm rethinking is whether or not I can leave a piece ending on an ambiguous note, or whether I need to force fit it into sort of a strong opinion and a sort of tone of certainty, because those are things that the social media ecosystem and social media reading habits will incentivize you thinking about. So now I really worry about the aspiring essayist or the aspiring thinker who is writing everything they write with those set of factors already shaping their thought.
No, I think that's so beautiful, and it really gives structure to my mind about how I've thought about this, where it feels like a key factor in determining this is who's the consumer. And I find that with art that perhaps I create, and even if we were to see essays and writing, which I do see as a form of art, I think the consumer is the person creating it. I think they're the first consumer. And when you work with that, what ends up being created versus when you create for like an algorithm or an audience or certain metrics, I think it's very different. It's something that I've struggled with as someone who does work in social justice and increasingly needs to be able to influence or talk about my work on social media. It's difficult to flatten it to certain platitudes. It's difficult to write in like 400 words because that's what performs well on LinkedIn, but my thoughts don't fit in 400 words. The complexity of the issue doesn't fit in that. And I think that's been such a I think war within myself about this. Also because I think for the longest time I've not seen myself as an artist or a writer. So I think when you start doing that work of like, okay, we have to put our thoughts out, it's much easier for me to see it from a content consumption lens. But a lot of what you said, I think, especially the part of thinking of an essay as a person's confessional, but at the same time watching them make sense of that confessional in the context of the world, I think that's something that really stayed with me because I do think that there is a certain commodification of personal experience in different forms, right? I think the essay you mentioned, will definitely link it in for people listening in. But I think when a person is able to situate that confessional into larger sense making, it has a truly transformative effect on people reading, people engaging, because it also gives them language to do that for themselves. Yeah. So I'm going to skip some questions and move to one very fundamental question for me, which is when you sit down to write an essay. What is your process like? Do you start with a personal experience or do you write a larger social observation? You mentioned that you've also always, I think, created the form of writing you wish to and then adapted it for social media, right? So I think with that freedom, what has that process been like?
I will admit that the first thing that usually takes hold is a discontentment. I am usually frustrated about something. That frustration could be a strong disagreement with a cultural practice. It could be confusion. It could be that something's happening in the news and I don't know how I feel about it, and I'm getting irritated that I don't know how I feel about it. Um, it could be, you mentioned earlier that I've written about beauty standards. That is a sort of conditioning that I have in me that I hate having in me. And that's the reason I keep sort of returning to that subject. Um, so it starts with a frustration, and it starts with a hypothesis about that frustration. This is what I'm annoyed by. This is wrong. This is what's screwed up in the world, whatever. And I sort of do a draft of my initial impulse. It involves reading. It involves sort of going and looking up what other people have said about whatever that experience is or whatever that piece of news is. And then I would say there are rounds and rounds of editing where what's happening is, like I said earlier, like a self-interrogation. And this is where another tangent, shall we? Okay. I'm sure you know this. I'm sure a lot of your listeners know this. But even if one person doesn't and they hear it here, I would be so excited, which is the etymology of the word essay, um, which comes from the French word. Montaigne used it first, I think, in the 1500s to describe a piece of writing. He used the French word essai, which in French meant to trial something, to test something, to experiment. And that word in French came from a much, much, much older Latin word, which was, I don't know how to pronounce it, but I think it's pronounced exagium. And an exagium was a really specific object in the Byzantine Empire. It was a small piece of glass or copper that was made to be the exact weight of the gold coins which they used as currency. And the use of this object was for, money exchangers or law officials to test whether the gold coins that they were coming across were really fully gold, or whether they had been diluted or cut into or whatever. I just love this. I find it so clarifying in terms of what an essay is meant to do, which is, at least for me, it is meant to test whether an impulse holds up to all the scrutiny you can bring to it, Um, whether an idea, whether your own framing of a personal experience, whatever it is that you are essaying about, the process is a weighing of it, a trialing of it, a testing of it to see, okay, am I really being as truthful as possible here? Am I being as sensible as possible in my understanding of the subject? So for me, that is all to say, to come back to the present tense on this desk where I write. For me, a lot of the process is an editing process of whatever it is I have just said, I believe. In that sense, it's also just a personally really useful process. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That's actually beautiful. And it's something that I'm going to hold with me to allow for such a powerful medium to be a work in progress. I think that's something I really take away from you. And you know what you said about you feel discontent, and then that leads to a hypothesis. It really takes me to this belief I've held that the most feminist emotion in me is my anger. It's my ability to feel that this is wrong and to feel like I must do something about it from the place I'm at or the role I have chosen in my life, which could be that of a writer, an artist, a speaker, a creator of any form, right? And I think that takes me to my most fundamental question of this episode, which is, do you see essays as an inherently feminist form? Or is it much more about how we use the form, especially given the example that you shared the form in itself holds so much value to be just something that's imperfect and that stems from a place of discontent and anger. And to me, that's really feminist about the form itself. Yeah, so over to you.
I love this question so much. And yeah, this question is the reason that I said yes to this podcast, even though I say no to every podcast that I'm invited to be on. I just find it to be such a thrilling question. In that, yeah, can we define a specific form as abiding to a certain ideology? I want to say yes. Okay, I just really want to say yes, to be honest. Um, That said, of course, we know superficially every form lends itself to every ideology, right? Um, one can, and many people have written horrifically patriarchal essays. The origins of Hindutva were in an essay written by Savarkar. So this is a dangerous form. It's a volatile form, like every form, right? We know that. But I think you're also right that there is something about this form, if done with utmost integrity, there's something about the process itself which mirrors what feminism, I think, aspires to be at its best. And I have a stack of books next to me because I wanted to reference them. And I'm going to reference one of them, if you will allow me. This is a great book of
Yes.
essays called The Right to Sex by Amia Srinivasan, who is a philosopher. And the very first words of the book, like the first words of the preface, are there are three sentences, and I'm going to read them. Uh, she writes, "Feminism is not a philosophy or a theory or even a point of view. It is a political movement to transform the world beyond recognition. It asks, what would it be to end the political, social, sexual, economic, psychological, and physical subordination of women? It answers, we do not know. Let us try and see." And I love this. And this is the first thing I thought of when um, I wondered if the essay is a feminist form, because this is a definition of feminism that posits very excitingly that feminism is a question. It's a question that a movement is asking the world. What would it be to end the subordination of women? And right now, the answer to that question by a really cutting edge feminist in the world is we don't know. Let's try and see. And the word try there, of course, really perfectly mirrors the try of the original French word of essay. And it's very thrilling. So, in a sense, this also positions a whole movement as an essay where feminism is a sort of question that you're using as an exagium, holding it against cultural practices, against your own life, and saying, does this practice hold up to the weight of equality between genders and the end of subordination? And where we're at right now is sort of mid essay. We haven't reached that point of certainty. We haven't reached a point of utter knowing what a feminist world would be like, but we're in the process of trying.
I can't tell you how much I love that. I think I'm going to go away with a visual of the essay as a living, breathing form in the feminist movement. And it gives me so much grounding because that's the movement I've come from. And to be able to see it as a story that is yet unanswered and that doesn't have a conclusion, but is trying different things, has different plot points, and will reach a climax at some point, right? I think that sort of yeah, just that visual is so strong for me. So really, thank you for that. It's something I'm going to keep with me, I think, for the rest of my life. And also just thinking of feminism as a movement that's asking the world that let's try and see, and rooting that back in what an essay does as well. I think that's really lovely. And it really also speaks to the essay is a disruptive form that doesn't give answers. I think earlier when you were speaking about also when you transfer it to the medium of, say, social media, the ambiguity is a question you stay with, right? Like, do I leave it ambiguous? Because there's so much certainty on digital platforms. There's always such absolutes. And the ability to hold on to a form that doesn't know yet, I think that's really powerful. Yeah.
Absolutely. I just want to sort of plus one to the idea that social media is uh, it's one of its fundamental grammars is certainty. And something I think of often is if we were able to numerically quantify all the phrases that have been spoken on social media and rank them by, most frequent to least frequent, I don't know, it would be last.
Oh,
But I
100%.
don't know is so central to an
Yeah.
essaying process.
Yeah.
It is the motor that sort of generates your
Mhm.
writing, is not knowing as yet. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I really feel you. I feel like every post starts with these are the 5 things that are going to fix this. And I don't even have one thing. Like I don't know how to get to 5. Um, but building off on that, in your essays, you write both about feminism quite explicitly. So there are essays that are very explicitly mentioning feminism, talking about it in that particular form. But at the same time, you're writing about like urban life, digital culture, social issues. And they're not very like, it's not overtly feminist, but when you read it, you can sense that there's an underlying like feminist approach and sensibility. How do you think about and how do you perhaps experience that distinction as well, if you do at all?
I don't know if I know the answer to that. I don't know how I experience that distinction. I will say I don't feel shy about using the word feminism. I know there's sometimes an anxiety that you will alienate a certain type of reader by using the explicit language of social movements, and I don't feel that. The other thing coming to mind is just the idea that you are wearing a kafia, you know this, that feminism is also an anti-imperialist movement. It's also an anti-capitalist movement. It's an anti-caste movement. In that sense, it is a movement against hierarchizing lives. And so I really see any effort to disrupt the hierarchizing of lives as a feminist effort. And here I'm not necessarily talking about myself as a writer, but other writers also. There might be, they might be occupied with a different struggle. But if their writing just sort of expands our idea of who is deserving of dignity, I do consider that feminist writing. Um, but the question you asked about my own writing, I genuinely do not know the answer. I'm going to keep thinking about it.
No, I actually think you not knowing the answer to that is what makes your writing so accessible, if I may say that. Like that's something that's always stayed with me is I think I said it in the beginning, right? Like I have friends who are not from the movement who get it. My partner gets it. I get it. Like I think it just serves such a broad spectrum. So perhaps it's the not knowing, right? You deal with really complex issues, but in a way that really feels very conversational and engaging. Um, so is that something you're thinking about, right? Like when you're writing, are you thinking about accessibility or is it just happening? And how do you balance this, the need for depth and nuance while ensuring readability? And do they have to be this oppositional thing? Yeah.
That's such an exciting question. In that, I again genuinely do not know how to play that balancing act, but it is something I think about. Something I think about is feminism is a journey that anyone who undertakes it goes on at a personal level, and there is the 101 level, and there is also the sort of a more advanced way of thinking about it. Um, and what order the lessons come in or the ideas come in sort of varies depending on your own position in the world and the experiences you're encountering. I struggle with this question in that uh, I don't want to. The most crude language I have for it is I don't want to dumb myself down for someone who has not yet encountered the entry level of feminism, or any sort of thinking or idea. I want to speak to the most curious possible reader, and um, a type of reader who has already thought about the world as much as I have. But it does sometimes feel like I'm leaving someone out. For instance, I mean, this is all very abstract, but I'll give you an example that I wrote an essay last week about choice feminism, and it had, yeah, you messaged about it. Yes, thank you. It had allusions to, for instance, having a Brahminical priest at your wedding as being a patriarchal act. Uh, or, but it had a whole list of, subscribing to beauty standards or consuming a certain type of culture. It had a host of examples of what constitute subscription to patriarchy. And someone messaged me saying, hey, thanks for writing this, but why is having a a priest at the wedding an act of patriarchy. And, they weren't unkind and they weren't critical. They were really genuinely very curious. And I recognized that I am, well, wait. I'm going to do it. I'm going to get it under, okay. So this is a feminist text in that uh, it speaks against the existence of caste and the way that all of Hinduism upholds caste, and caste is a patriarchal institution. And, caste and patriarchy are sort of co-constituted in India. That idea is implied in my essay about choice feminism, but it is not explained in that essay. And someone encountering that idea for the first time in that essay needs it explained genuinely. And I don't fault them for that. But not every essay can provide the rundown on every idea that it alludes to. And that is genuinely something I struggle with. And I don't know what the solution to it is, except to make sort of a reading list, like a syllabus for, thinking through feminism in India. And maybe that's why a book club like Sanskaari Girls is sort of crucial. Because all I could do for this person was send them a list of links and say, okay, well, here's where that idea comes from. I didn't come up with it. It's been written through by Dalit feminists for the most part, but, happy reading. But yeah, I do struggle. I do actually genuinely struggle with that question.
Hmm. Thanks for sharing that so openly. I think what stayed with me is you wanting your readers to be curious. And I wonder someone going through the essay, feeling stuck at a point, and instead of rejecting the idea, extending the curiosity to say, what does this mean? And it doesn't sit well with me. Maybe I don't get it. But reaching out in a kind manner, right? I wonder if that in itself is the spark of curiosity required, because that's something we struggle with when we do political education work in different forms. Um, is at what point do we say, this is not my job? Or this is not my role to teach you. But if I'm able to inspire curiosity to seek answers or to ask the right questions, is that a job well done? So I mean, that's what I'm taking away. Like, I feel like if someone reads a line and it makes them think and want to know that why was this a part of it, I think that's a really powerful thing as well.
Absolutely. And in that sense, I will say I'm very lucky that I think the readers that have sort of stuck with me to the point that I'm at now are really very thoughtful and kind to me as readers. So, yeah, 100%. Yes.
So that's good to hear and good to know. I think it's also a little bit of what I've sensed in your writing, where there is an inherent respect for the reader. There is an inherent care for the reader. And I think it translates into how perhaps an essay or a piece of writing is consumed. And that also makes me think about, how is your essay process happening, right? Do you think there's also something about the form and your way of thinking that is particularly suited to feminist thought when it comes to challenging ideas, especially like, really entrenched ideas? Do you think the essay as a form allows for it and allows you to do it differently than any other form would have?
I'm often curious about writing a novel and what sort of self exploration and expansion that would allow for. So I don't know. I don't know where it falls with regards to other forms. And I don't want to create a hierarchy of forms also. I think the feminist novel has a very important place in the world, as you all definitely know. That said, it does allow me to do something specific in my life, in that we are also, every feminist is also a subject of patriarchy. We just live in a patriarchal world. And so we've been conditioned by patriarchy, whether we like it or not. And so any process of self-interrogation is useful and sort of crucial to living a feminist life. Because we have instincts in us. We have desires in us, yearnings in us that are patriarchal, in fact. And the only way to sort of, if not get rid of all of them, at least sort of bring them to the light and hold them up to our own scrutiny and the scrutiny of what we know of feminist thought, is to articulate them and pose questions to them. And for me, that is the essay. That is essentially what the essay is.
Oh, I love that. I think as a reader, what essays have allowed me to do, as you articulated so beautifully, is I think it allows me a private exploration of shame sometimes. because there's such an inherent fight with my patriarchal desires, things that are, I can call it social conditioning, but it's still something I live with. It's a desire, a want that I live with. And I think as a form, it really gives me that private space to process that, to hopefully mostly overcome it and to be able to do something differently or make a choice differently than I would have earlier. Yeah, so really, that's something that is going to stay with me. And I think it's really the power of a form that speaks directly to a reader or directly to someone consuming, interrogating, just engaging with it, is to allow that personal exploration of feeling without becoming like open to public scrutiny. So I think that's really powerful. Um, I think thinking along these lines, I noticed recently that you're also sort of convening this offline community around essays through a Chennai club, which I'm hoping anyone who's a listener and who's in Chennai will 100% be going for. So I'm curious about that, like how has that landscape changed for you as someone who I would call is very digitally native, because that's where a lot of your work has been. What has changed in the purpose of the essay, in its reach? What is the point of an offline community when there's an online one? Yeah. So how has that evolved for you?
Very good question. And I would sort of rewind the question a couple of steps and even say, what is the purpose of a community to read with at all when reading is, something that inherently happens between you and the page? It is a solitary act, and it's very powerful as a solitary act. So much of my love for the essay or any form of reading and literature is also a love for solitude and a love for being with myself and in conversation with my own subjectivity and selves, I should say. So I was myself surprised when I felt a desire for a group to read with and think with. I think part of where it came from is that I just did a master's last year, and I found myself so thoroughly enjoying, after many years of pandemic living, I found myself so thoroughly enjoying sitting in a classroom around a table with a group of thoughtful people who had crucially all read the same material before arriving at that table and had all taken different things from it, or had different questions to pose for it. I found that process delightful. And it really ruptured my sense of myself as a solitary thinker, someone who can only nourish herself intellectually alone. I was wrong. It turns out I was wrong. How exciting. And so after the master's, I moved to Chennai, which is where I grew up. And I did play with the idea of doing it online. But I think there's a part of me that's also still recovering from lockdown, at some sense. I don't want more Zoom screens in my life. I simply do not. And I really want the sort of texture of being in a room together. And yeah, all of the sort of body language type of exchange that allows, which I really enjoyed on a campus as a master's student. And so this Chennai Essay Club is a utter experiment. I didn't make it a book club because those exist, and I sort of want to elevate the essay as a form. I want to elevate Indian writers of the essay. Specifically, it's getting more and more specific as the months go on, and as the essay club meets, it has become South Indian essayists that we sort of keep going back to. There's just something more exciting about reading something local, I find. And it's been delightful, similar to what I was saying about the master's experience. Exactly that is happening. We all read the same piece, and then we come together and have all read different pieces, actually, in a sense, because we have brought our own lenses to the essay at hand. And it's just a lot of fun. And we include a little snack potluck and a little coffee and a little tea, and it's just wonderful. It's one weekend a month, just 2 hours in a room together. And then that's it. I love it.
I love that. Thank you. I think the community aspect of it really brings to life being able to surround yourself with people that care about the essay, care about thinking about things. Also, what you said about your masters, I felt that as well when I went for my masters. I said, I used to feel like I only want to think about these things alone. But being able to do that in a room that can hold space for even conflicting thoughts has been so powerful. And I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent. So I'm going to hopefully be allowed to do that as well. A big reason for me to start this book club is when I was much younger. I think I was much younger. I couldn't speak very well in English. I could barely speak in English. And my mom can't speak English, and it really held her back from a lot of life opportunities. And I remember the first time a teacher wrote that in my report card. My mother's like, "This needs to change because I don't want this to happen to my child." And the way she did is she took me to a library because she couldn't teach me English. She couldn't teach me something she didn't know. So she said, let me
Wow.
take you somewhere. And I will say this, that my mother is someone who still studied by translating like Plato's Republic from English to Hindi to be able to write exams, translating it back into English. So she knew the value of being able to read and learn and engage. And she took me there. And I'm so grateful for that. But over that process, what ended up happening is, I read my Hardy Boys, I read my Famous Five, I read all of those. I didn't understand what an English tea was because that never happened at home. Um, I didn't understand a lot of what was happening in the books.
Yeah.
And that was a really big reason for me to think of a space like the book club. Because sometimes I just want to read a book that speaks to my location, that speaks to even the challenges of the communities I live in, to the oppressions that perhaps I'm party to. I want to be able to interrogate it from a lens of being able to live that as well. So when you said, how it's just getting more specific, I feel like the idea started saying, oh, it can just be a feminist book club. And then it got more specific because there's just such a shared desire to read more like us. And to then be able to dissent with it, to fight back with some of its to really engage and say this doesn't work. Like in the book club, we're trying more and more to not just read feminist literature, but to read literature written by women and queer authors from South Asia and read it from a feminist lens. So to be able to over time build that lens of what does it mean for a text to be feminist? What does it mean for me for a text to be feminist, even if it doesn't subscribe to a larger ideology? Yes, what you said really, really resonated with me. Thank you for that.
Of course. Everything you said just resonated with me as well, and also really moved me. Your mother sounds incredible. Just incredible.
She is. I will pass that on, but she really, really is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know we're running over, but I'm sure the listeners would love listening in to more of the questions. I'm gonna maybe take a couple of more from the ones that we've thought through. I think one that's come across through just chatting with you today as well is that there's something really vulnerable about essay writing. You're really putting yourself out there for critique, for feedback, for even like backlash. And as someone who's been writing publicly and just been online for so many years, how do you handle or like live with that vulnerability, especially with such like political topics that can really engage a certain type of backlash as well? What has that been like for you? Anything you feel open to sharing?
I will say there are two types of backlash that I have faced, and I have very different relationships with both of them. One is I'm expressing a feminist idea or an anti-Hindutva idea or an anti-caste idea, and I'm getting a lot of rage from men's rights activists or right-wing, Twitter accounts. And that backlash is profoundly validating. It it has really made me feel like we are on the right track. We are pissing the right people off. Let's go. Let's keep going. There is another type of backlash I have received many, many years ago for not having a sort of fleshed out and correct understanding of caste, let's say. I grew up and am of a privileged caste position. So to learn about Ambedkarism was a sort of self-education I had to put myself through in my 20s. And before that point, I wasn't saying perfectly responsible things in terms of the anti-caste movement. And that was a type of backlash that I received uh, and was really, really grateful for. It is obviously uncomfortable when it first happens. When you first see that tweet with your name in it saying, so and so is platforming this incorrect idea or has missed out this, fundamental point. It's uncomfortable. But if you can sort of take that discomfort and metabolize it into, again, if you can essay with it, if you can sort of take that ache and that confusion and take it to the literature, take it to the bookshelf, take it to the library. You can sort of emerge improved. So I used to think all calling out is bad, calling out all, internet backlash is bad, but it's actually been a very educative process for me to be learning in public.
Thanks for sharing that, Rega, and thanks for being vulnerable about it here as well. Yeah, I think there is a lot of coming of age that for a lot of us is happening online, we like it or not. And that invariably means there's a lot of learning and failing in public. And call outs can perhaps have a space there, right? So, yeah, no, really, thank you for sharing that. Also, what you shared in the beginning around, as a younger person, especially I think as a younger woman, wanting your life's experiences to be something that are public because they feel so uniquely you. And I feel like at the same time, they also feel like experiences that you've had to really fight for, to hold on to be able to have. And I think that's where the desire for like a public acknowledgement of this has happened and this is real and this was a part of my life perhaps stems from. And I think maybe it's a question of power, right? I feel that with me. I mean, I turned 30 last year and 31 this year. And I feel like so much has changed for me, even just with the comfort of not needing approval, not needing validation, or feeling much more comfortable. So I think that coming of age of that form of validation also really warping your own sense of self sometimes as a writer. Um, yeah, I've always wondered that do writers look in the mirror and see themselves as themselves, or do they see themselves as how people have thought of them and communicated that to them, but not to put that existential question into your head. I've always thought this of writers because it's so, I think, vulnerable and difficult to put out art and put out yourself into the world. And does it really, reshape who you see yourself as? But yeah, I know it's a tough question. There's no answer to it, but it's something that I've thought about often.
I just wanted to say to the first point you raised about turning 30 and what a relief that can be. I just want to say something I've been thinking about as I have entered my early 30s is I can't wait to be 40 and I can't wait to be 50. And I can't wait to know the relief of more and more wisdom sort of settling in and pressures lifting, there's a part of me that's really stoked to know what being postmenopausal is like. Right? Um, yeah, just thrilled with aging as a woman.
Oh, 100%. Like, I remember being in my teens and being like, oh my God, I never want to get old. And now I just can't wait for it. I think it's made my life easier. And I feel that with every person I know, every woman I know who's hitting 30 and hitting 40, they're just so happy. I want to get there. Yeah. When we're speaking about the sort of responses we get, you mentioned that you went for your master's. You studied South Asian politics at Oxford. And I wondered if that's given you a certain lens when it comes to talking about complex issues about power, governance, social structures. And has an academic training changed how you write your essays? I know you mentioned, there's the argumentative essay, there's the academic essay. Do you feel like it's really shapeshifted your essay in some way?
Thank you for asking this question, which I thought no one would ever in the world be interested in. um, Here's the fun reality. When I started my master's, I was so bad at writing academically. The first few submissions I gave in to my professors got the worst comments. One of them pulled me in and said, "Look, you are too trained in working in media. You are too trained in creative writing. You need to rein in all of this stylistic shit you're doing and get really boring about this." And she was very kind, and she was making a necessary intervention for me to get through that course, right? Where she said, just give us the facts, just give us the citations, give us the argument in the first paragraph, and then do exactly what you say you're going to do in your introduction. And in the conclusion, repeat it again. And the nonfiction, narrative, creative writing essayist in me was just dying at this set of instructions. I was like, no, professor, I want to lead you there through this juicy path of metaphor and unknowing. But of course, that's not what they need from you. So I spent a lot of time and effort figuring out how to do the academic essay. And once I felt comfortable with that form, with reining in basically every instinct I had as a writer and doing that form, I found that I could begin to reintroduce some elements of style and tone and, just a personal voice while sticking to what they needed for me to do. Also, put a nice juicy quote in the introduction and use a metaphor here and there which holds up to what the citations are saying. And that end point that I got to by the end of the year, where I was able to sort of follow the academic formula but bring a little bit of voice into it, felt like such an achievement to me. And these essays were marked well. They did great. And I think they did well in part because I was able to do, both those things. I can also imagine an examiner sitting faced with, 40 essays that are 10,000 words long each, and they all follow the same formula. I can imagine them being refreshed when one of them tosses in a metaphor here or there, or has a sort of a voice to it. So I was really grateful to be sort of whipped into shape doing a different kind of writing than I had been used to. And yes, I think I have been able to bring that back into my public essaying and my sort of more creative and personal essaying, in the sense of having more rigor of research. Obviously, I think academia just trains us in being better at looking up and familiarizing ourselves with what others have said about whatever it is we're talking about. And then also having, just a sort of higher bar for what constitutes a true argument. What am I like? That whole process of self-interrogation where you're asking yourself, is this true? Is this honest? Is this sensible? Is this reasonable? Is this feminist? Um, Whatever one's questions are that you bring to the edit process. Academia did train me in being even more rigorous in that scrutiny, and I'm grateful for it. I think there is a valid perspective that some writers have, that it can de-radicalize your thinking to get too deep into, the academy. Certainly an academy like Oxford, which is sort of the heart of imperialism. But I think just giving myself a flash exposure for 1 year and then running away promptly and coming back into the world was the way to do it for me.
No, I love that. I think a lot of this is something that stayed with me when I was in college and when I was writing. And I went to a really left leaning, I went to the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex, which is very left leaning. And I remember a lot of my professors saying, your essay doesn't work academically, but it's a great piece of activist writing. And I love that they gave me the option of letting it be. They said, if that's who you are and that's who you want to be, then that's okay. But really still working with me to improve, I think, the parts that you spoke about, right? Like the rigor. I think especially like a certain respect for evidence and logic, and being able to marry that with the feeling of the work I do. I think that's something I really took away. So what you shared really stays with me. Like there are some things that I did because I had to and I got through it. But there is so much influence of the different experiences we have on how we write our essays. I'd be so curious to like look at two essays and be like, okay, did the form change? Did the structure change? Did it get more evidence heavy? Yeah, so that's really beautiful. And I think the acknowledgement of where our academic structures come from and the sort of structures they tend to, replicate both within our minds and within the systems we occupy is really important here as well. So really thanks for bringing that in. Which takes me to one question about responsibility, right? Like responsibility of writing and responsibility of existing perhaps publicly as well. When our writing is reaching a much larger audience as yours does, both with personal experience, otherwise, what does that responsibility mean for you, given the sort of impact it can have?
That is a question that sort of, um, cuts straight to my soul, so to speak, because I really think about it a lot, and I have thought about it for many years. My answer keeps shifting, but it is a it is a burden I'm aware of. It is a weight I'm aware of that I wasn't always aware of, and so I'm sort of grateful to have that awareness. Um, the way it feels to me, the way that responsibility, the way I experience it textually, I suppose, is as a constant awareness of my own place structurally, a sort of constant, genuinely unshakable awareness of what privileges allow me to have a voice in public. What does it mean to have had an English medium education? What does it mean to have a caste location, a class location? And what does it mean to occupy space in discourse as a person of those locations? I have a fundamental discomfort. I'll just sort of, say that I have a very deep discomfort with taking up too much space from those locations. Um, and I'm okay with that discomfort. I wasn't always, but I am now. I also didn't always have that discomfort because I didn't always have this awareness. So there was a point, again, when I was 22, 23, where I was on very many panels giving my opinions on all sorts of things and posting on every platform as much as I could and as much as I felt like. And that was before the dawning of full structural awareness of my own place in the world. And again, I don't fault my younger self for what she didn't know. But at this point, I am deliberate about what it is I draw attentional real estate for and towards. Of course, the maddening and frustrating reality is that there are all sorts of, patriarchal, Brahminical morons, white men, just taking up all the attention they want without thinking about these questions. And so I'm also in a tussle with the discomfort in that, self erasure will be an instinct that the the people aware of these structures will have, and the people not aware of them will just keep sort of leaning into the consumerist logic of drawing as much attention as possible. So I'm just trying to balance those impulses, I suppose.
No, I'm grateful for that introspection. I think to be able to think through both the production itself rather than just the impact, I think is really powerful. And it's a discomfort that I'm also learning to deal with. I will not say that I'm at that point perhaps where you are, where I still feel like um, what is my space? Given my own caste location, which is that of an oppressor caste, my queer identity, disability, geography, like all of these things coming together, it really is an interrogation of space, of impact, and of just how much voice, right? Like there is a point to how much voice, how many platforms. So I really appreciate that introspective interrogation. And I know because so many people will be listening in, I also really appreciate the gentleness to a younger self. Um, I think as feminists, sometimes the danger for me is, at least that's something I feel, is that maybe become too hard with the world, but I never want to reach a point where I'm too hard with myself. Like I want to be able to hold that space that allows me to change and grow as a person, because when that's so central to feminist ethics, how do I not do that for myself? But that also feels the most difficult. So I think that's something that, yeah, I hope that anyone listening in really takes away that all of this is so much of a journey, and being able to hold your younger self with gentleness and to make space for yourself to be a work in progress is really, really important. Yeah, no, thank you for that. So with that, I'm going to come to the last question, which is for our listeners who might want to try, writing an essay or who want to read essays with maybe a more intersectional feminist lens. What do you suggest? And how do you maybe, help our listeners think about how do you recognize when an essay is doing feminist work or it's not, especially given how insidious it's getting sometimes? Yeah, so over to you for the advice.
Thank you, Vandita. Uh, this has been a wonderful conversation in that it has made me think newly about my own processes of reading, writing, being online, being feminist. And I often think to myself and I often say there is really no greater gift a person can give another person than a generous question. And you have given me so many. So thank you very much. To answer your questions, where does one begin So I'll answer the last question first, if that's okay. When is an essay doing feminist work? I have a really uncompromising answer to this question, which is an essay is doing feminist work when it is countering patriarchal logics and structures and practices. Um, that can look like sort of very explicitly, it can look like this, where you are explicitly naming patriarchy as a structure and countering it um, directly in your words. It can look like this, where you are naming structures that are complicit in patriarchy, that enable patriarchy, that rely on patriarchy, and you are countering those other structures. Equally, I have such a big stack here that I want to show you. It can it can look like these, which may not name patriarchy, that as an English word as we know it, but they expand our sense of the subjectivity of women, of queer people, of queer experiences. One place for readers to definitely go, I think, is Professor Annie Zaidi's Unbound, which makes this really ambitious attempt to capture a 2000-year history of Indian women's writing. Not everything in here is an essay. In fact, there's a lot of poetry, there's a lot of fiction, but there are essays, there is nonfiction. And it really, once you sort of work through her introduction and just flip through the book, you come away with this deeply enriched and unforgettable sense that writing is an Indian woman's legacy, that this is not something new we are attempting, that we are part of a long lineage of women who have uh, made great efforts to teach themselves how to read and write and be published, and at great personal risk interrogate structures in their work. There are three that really I think of. One is Rassundari Devi, who was a Bengali woman writing in the 1800s, who was the first woman to publish an autobiography in India. And there's a wonderful excerpt from her autobiography in Annie Zaidi's Unbound. And she's writing about how grueling it was for her to teach herself to read at a time where women were not allowed to read. Uh, and then I also wanted to mention Pandita Ramabai and Tarabai Shinde, who were women doing anti-caste writing in the 1800s, and they were doing them in the form of essays. So any sense we might have that this is a foreign form, an internet age form, is BS. And we should very much feel like this is our legacy, and it's a legacy of interrogating culture as we experience it around us.
Thank you for that. It's really a legacy of being able to pass on our voice as well. And it's really lovely to see more essays doing that.
Current contemporary South Asian feminist essays that I'm really very excited about, that I think people should be reading. I think Vijeta Kumar, who goes by Ram Lola Ram online, is possibly the best contemporary writer we have in terms of just the craft of an essay. And she writes about her experiences teaching, she writes about language, and she writes about how, just our experiences of being women in cities and in the world are inflected by caste. I also want to recommend Zanan Wanan, which is a journal of Kashmiri feminist writers. Um, and just it has poetry in it, it has essays, it also has some academic writing. It's just a very exciting assemblage. And I want to recommend Richa Kaul Pajte, who has this phenomenal and expansive body of work about gender, about sexuality. She has a book called Cyber Sexy, which is really very, very fun. And she also, she writes about chronic illness and about how that inflects our experiences as women in the world and as people in the world. I also have to recommend Meena Kandasamy, specifically for writing about, what has spoken to me is her writing about feminism as part of the Tamil nationalist movement in Sri Lanka. So I feel like there's a lot of ways to be countering patriarchy in writing. I do want to note very specifically that one doesn't even have to be a woman to be countering patriarchy, and one doesn't even have to be writing or thinking about gender. So this is a book by my partner E01, and it's about nature, and it's about the shorelines of Chennai and Tamil Nadu. And that and many other books that I think of, even though they are written by men and though they are not explicitly about gender, they uh, they are written by men who are opening up about their own interiority, which is also a logic that patriarchy sort of suppresses. It's an act that patriarchy suppresses. So when a man is writing in a way that sort of reveals himself to be an emotional being, a person who feels more than just anger, a person who feels hurt and anxiety and uncertainty, I consider that as a feminist act and as feminist writing as well. Um, what else do so here's another man who wrote about feminism. This is Periyar's Why Women Got Enslaved. I don't agree with every single conclusion he comes to, but I think fundamentally, the questions he's asking here are very, very feminist. And I myself am currently reading The Vulgarity of Caste. And it's an academic work, it's a scholarly work, but the line is really blurred between where an essay ends and scholarship begins, especially when it's written very accessibly and rooted in our country as it is. That was such a long answer, but there it is.
Oh, I love that. I think we're going to leave anyone listening in with a long list. So we'll also compile it and share it with them. I think these recommendations are beautiful because through them, I think we get a sense of how do you recognize when an essay is doing feminist work. And for me, as someone who occasionally writes and does research, reading is a fundamental first step to it. And I think this is a great list to get started, to start thinking about forms of writing, feminist thought in writing, and really making feminism this underlying foundation of our work and not necessarily always the explicit answer to everything in our essays. So I love that. Thank you so much for being with us today. Rega, honestly, this episode has gone way over time because I've just had one of the best and most insightful conversations with you. I was like, okay, what are we going to talk about when it comes to the essay for so long? And it's a form that I love, but that's it, right? Like it's a form you love, but there's so much to it. Both from its very structure as a feminist form to its use to furthering social justice. So really, thank you for sharing your perspective and all the essay writing that you do. It really makes feminism so much more accessible and engaging for many readers. And I think given just everything in the world, it's really important to be able to find writing that speaks to you and nudges you to do things the right way. Thank you so much. And for all our listeners, we'll include all the links. We will definitely be including Rega's newsletter, which is Years Now Studies, and some of her essays as well in our show notes. And as always, we'd love to hear from you on any essays that have moved you or made you think differently. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Rega.
Thank you, Vandita. This was really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, everyone. This has been the Sanskaari Girls podcast, and I'm Vandita. A big reminder to everybody to follow us on Instagram and also sign up to be a member. It's free. And please subscribe to our newsletter as well. I also want to take a minute to give a big shout out to Anjali, who's been on production and scripting, and to Kuhu on overall coordination and support. We hope you keep reading, keep writing, and just keep finding new ways to make your voice heard through the written word. Thank you so much.